So we're good.
All right.
Yeah. Good evening to those of you tuning in. We deeply appreciate your time this evening. It is Friday night, and we are ready for a cocktail hour with some historical background. I am Dr. James Brumall, an associate professor of history at Shepherd University and the director of the George Heather Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And I am accompanied today by Catherine Oliver, the assistant at the center, who has a whole host of interests ranging from the 18th to the 20th centuries. And tonight she'll be moving us into unfamiliar territory, and that is, of course, the 20th century. Nonetheless, as always, we will contextualize what we are doing in a historical background, and we'll do something fun and interesting. And so with that, Catherine, what is the cocktail on the agenda this evening, and where would one consume this cocktail in most instances?
Two very important questions. Our cocktail this evening is the Blue Hawaiian, the original recipe dating from 1957. And this was something conceived at the height of what is known as the Tiki bar phase of the mid-20th century. So that is going to be our exploration this evening, hence my hair. So I thought it might be helpful to start maybe with setting the stage a little bit.
Yeah, so what exactly is a tiki bar? And as I was telling Catherine beforehand, in my graduate school days, I spent a good deal of time in dive bars, Irish pubs that didn't have a great deal of ambiance, but certainly had a lot of character. But I'm not sure if I made it to a tiki bar. And so maybe you could sort of locate us in that context. And we'll go
this is a very unique experience. So what I'd like to invite you to do, as we are going to do a little bit of time traveling this evening, perhaps if you feel comfortable in your own home, maybe even closing your eyes as I set the stage for you. It's been a wonderful, appropriately tropical day today where I live, with warm sun shining all day long. And I don't know if you can hear, the microphone will pick it up, but my windows are still open and there are birds singing outside, and I have these wonderful breezes that are coming in, and it's so soft and balmy and just so relaxing. So just sort of sit back wherever you are. We're going to do something really extraordinary and leave our homes. We're going to leave our kitchens and our living rooms and our entertainment centers that are no longer quite so entertaining, and just sort of drift away on those nice, soft, warm breezes and let them carry us back in time and carry us far away in our imaginations. As we're drifting away, if you can imagine the sight of a brightly flickering flame coming up ahead as we approach a deeply burning flame. And we can see the reds and oranges and yellows and even whites and blues at the heart of the flame shifting around in the twilight. And as we get closer and closer, we can imagine that there is not just one flame, but actually a row of flames. And as we get even closer, we come to understand that these are torches that are towering over our heads, and we get to walk between them. We're going to walk down this line of torches, down this long causeway, and we can feel the heat just enough to know it's a real flame flickering off of our faces, and just enough to remember that fire is a little dangerous. We're going to walk between them. We know that something unique is about to happen. We approach a place that is covered in bamboo, and has all of these wonderful flowers as we pass them. This exotic perfume of plants we've never smelled before just invade our senses. And it's just intoxicating, just smelling so many flowers at once. We step inside our tiki bar, and we are greeted with warm, bright smiles, and perhaps We are even invited to place a circlet of flowers around our necks as if we're embarking onto a true island adventure and being welcomed to somewhere like Hawaii or some other wonderful place. And we're guided to our table. And as we're walking to our table, we are passing these towering carved masks hanging from the walls, some carved from wood, some are on the floor that are carved from what appears to be stone, and they're all wearing different wild faces. Some of them appear to be angry, and we can't imagine why they're so angry, but there must be some curse attached to them. And some of them are just look happy, but in a mad, crazy way. And perhaps they have another story they can tell us. And some of them don't even have the right number of eyes or the right number of mouths. And they're just staring at us, boring into our souls. We pass also familiar faces that we've only ever seen on movie screens. We pass famous people like Fred Astaire, like Joan Crawford, Marlene Dietrich. All of the greatest stars of the era are filling this space and are dressed in the most glamorous tropical gowns you can possibly imagine. We get to our table and we are seated and we have all of these wonderful things happening around us that we're experiencing on so many levels. And we start to examine the menu. And our noses are filled again now with the sense of food, spices that we've never smelled before. We don't know what these dishes are, but I bet it's going to be amazing. We also begin to examine the different textures around us. We're sitting on these funny chairs that appear to be made of straw. It's wicker. It's very exciting. We have plush pillows surrounding us, soft music from another land is playing, maybe a little drum beat, maybe there are dancers in the background. But while we are looking at all these things, all of a sudden we find ourselves startled by a flash of what seems to be lightning inside the restaurant, inside the bar. But how can that be? How can there be lightning inside the bar? It can't be real. And we continue to look at our menus. And sure enough, in another moment, we hear the roar of some thunder in the distance. That's very strange. It's almost scary. It's almost scary. But then we find even on the windows, right beside where we're sitting, we hear the distinct pitter-patter of a fierce rainstorm, fresh off the Pacific wilds, rushing against the windows. Surely our whole little tiki bar will be torn to pieces, and it's almost frightening, except we know that we're safe because we know it's just a game. None of this is real. It's a tiki bar. So open your eyes if you've been playing along with this visualization, and welcome to our virtual tiki bar. I'm going to offer you a drink in a moment and ask you, or rather invite you to make one with me. But I wanted to start with this sort of visualization experience to give you a taste of this very peculiar world that so fascinated so many people in the mid-20th century. This was a sensory-rich experience unlike anything else that Americans had access to. And it was so provoking to the imaginations that it actually is an inspiration for much of Disneyland's early sensory ride experiences. They credit the tiki bars with giving them the ideas for things like the pirate experience and these rides, Pirates of the Caribbean. So, we're gonna explore this weird world of showmanship in a little bit, but let me tell you about the drink.
Yeah, well, quickly, we'll welcome the guests that have tuned in from Massachusetts down to Georgia thus far. I don't see anyone claiming to be in a tiki bar tonight, but nonetheless, some of you may have been in one in the past. And so while at a tiki bar, Catherine, what would one have consumed Ooh, at least in the mid 20th century.
Well, a lot of these drinks that are created during this time, they're all going to have some sort of tropical flavor in them.
Okay.
What we're going to be focusing on tonight is the Blue Hawaiian. There's a very similar drink called the Blue Hawaii, and sometimes they get mismatched, and that's okay. The ingredients, if you want to play along at home for the original 1957 recipe, you will need a little bit of vodka, a little bit of rum, a little bit of the magical blue mixture, a little bit of simple syrup, pineapple juice, lemon or lime juice, depending on your taste, and pineapple slice if you wish to garnish. You may also like umbrellas.
They're hard to come by these days.
I have quite a few of these, strangely. But anyway.
That's another story for
That's
another day.
Story. So to the physical things that you will need to make this happen, you will need something to stir your drink with. You'll need a glass. Traditionally, this would be made in a hurricane-shaped glass.
Sure.
I thought it would be fun to drag out an actual Tiki glass. You can see his crazy face.
And you just happen to have that at the house as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to say yes.
Sure. Okay. Just checking in.
Yeah. So to get started, what you would do is you would fill your glass with ice.
Is it crushed or whole?
That's really a matter of preference. I prefer mine whole. For this particular drink, it's a little easier to stir, I think. And for measuring, if you have official barware at home, you might have the little jiggers that you can use. I'll be giving measurements for the recipe in ounces. If you don't want to measure them in cups, I'll also tell you what they are in teaspoons, because a lot of people more people seem to have teaspoons than bar measurements. So for the vodka, the right one here, you would need 4.5 teaspoons of vodka in your drink. That is 3/4 of an ounce.
Okay.
3, 4.5. And you would need the same amount of rum. Now you should be using, there are many types of rum. The original recipe calls for a white Puerto Rican rum. So that should be your first clue about something we're going to talk about with all of these drinks. If we're making a traditional Hawaiian drink, why are we using Puerto Rican rum? But this is what the recipe called for. So another 4.5 teaspoons of rum. 3, 4.5. Then we need 1/2 an ounce or 3 teaspoons of blue. You can see it's already getting that lovely blue flavor, blue color. Then we need our pineapple juice. And we need a full ounce of pineapple juice, which is 6 teaspoons, or if you want to save yourself some trouble, 2 tablespoons. We have so much fun doing math. This is so many subjects here. We have history, we have math, we have geography.
Could be why I say
right?
Away from mixed drinks is the
yes.
math that's involved. So.
Yes. The next ingredient that you will need is your lime or lemon.
Okay.
Things over here. And if you have a lime or lemon juice that is already pre-made, that's great. You're going to need 1/2 ounce or 3 teaspoons of that. If you don't, bear with me. I have to actually get my lime juice out of the lime. That's what all the strange sounds are right now. The little citrus squeezer. Okay, and that goes in our glass. The last ingredient for this particular recipe is a simple syrup. And that one requires 1/2 ounce or 3 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon of simple syrup. And that goes in the glass as well. So if you've had a Blue Hawaiian before, you're probably looking at me right now wondering, what is she doing adding all of these different alcohols? And you would have a very good reason for asking that question, because if you ordered this drink today, it probably is not going to have vodka in it. It usually will just have the rum. That modification came later and pretty soon rather than later. But when the bartender, Harry Yee, who I'll talk about in a moment, invented this, it was an on-the-spot demand to create a drink from ingredients that he had, and he decided he was going to have vodka that day, and so it did. So last thing we need is to stir. So I have my stirring guy, and can garnish with a little bit of pineapple if you wish. My pineapple is not so pretty. It's just a standard slice out of a can because I didn't feel like fighting the grocery store to get a fresh pineapple. So that's what we're going to do. And I am also going to improvise and throw in a cocktail cherry, which sometimes happens. So there is our Blue Hawaiian.
Okay.
And this actually should have another garnish, which I don't have because I don't have access to them, which would be a fresh orchid.
Oh.
Just sitting prettily on the side of the glass.
Okay.
So when this was invented in 19...
I'm shocked you don't have that, Catherine. I mean,
I don't. Actually, I had something that I was going to... Here we go. I don't have a fresh orchid, but I do have access to fake flowers at Michael's, so.
Close enough.
Close enough. Don't try to actually eat a fake flower or a real orchid. That could be bad for you as well.
Okay. Sound advice.
Yes. So as I said, the inventor of this drink is a bartender, a Hawaiian bartender by the name of Harry Yee. And he invented it on the spot, on demand, which was kind of something he was used to. Harry had been working in a bar in Waikiki throughout much of the Tiki phase as it was developing. And like many bartenders in Hawaii, he was kind of startled and stumped at first when American tourists were coming in and asking for authentic Hawaiian drinks because there were none. It just was not part of the existing culture. But wanting to please the tourists and keep them coming back, he was happy to invent some authentic drinks for them to use. So the Blue Hawaiian is one example of these inventions. He invented it, basically the sales representative for the syrup came along and wanted him to test it out and see what he could do with it. And as I said, he basically just pulled some things off the bar and mixed it up, and everybody thought it was a hit. So there you have it.
Why do you think, I mean, just kind of broadly thinking on this, that when tourists go to areas, they sort of seek out, kind of quote unquote authentic cuisine or authentic drinks? I mean, what do you think the impulse behind that is? And I guess to sort of stave off disappointment, in this instance, someone's literally fabricating something to create a sense of authenticity. You know, what does that stem from, you think, or what does
Like,
that speak to?
there's always a natural curiosity when we are traveling, when we're in a new place that we've not been before. Um, we want to experience that place, and one of the ways that we experience a place is through its food culture or through its drink culture. Um, and I think we also have to appreciate just the business aspect here as to why people would invent drinks. Uh, they want tourists to come. They want this industry to develop. And in the mid 20th century, we are seeing the tourist industry really take off. Air travel is becoming more and more accessible. People are seeing lots more advertising. They're able to access the islands. So there's an industry that's developing, and these are business people who want to seize that opportunity.
And I think it's important to pause here. I mean, in the 19th century, Americans certainly traveled, but I mean, more often than not, it was a year-long trip if they were wealthy to Europe, maybe several months abroad. But by and large, I mean, your world is relatively circumscribed. You know, whereas in the post-World War I era, as you mentioned, you know, Americans are for the first time really traveling abroad in greater quantities. It's accessible to middle and upper class Americans. Most certainly, those audiences are growing in number, and so this international impulse that starts to evolve. And you know, in fundamental ways, as we'll talk about here in a bit, this is also a narrative that's entwined with the wartime experiences for many Americans, both during the Great and Second World Wars. And so there is this larger cultural shift that's going on at this moment in time. Um, and so what's happening, and what we could speak to, is that they're importing, if you will, some of that culture from abroad back to the States. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so we do see then some key figures emerging in the 1930s and the 1940s who are themselves on the West Coast starting to try to replicate, or even, I guess, fabricate elements of these tiki bars and this culture. So can you tell us a little bit more
Sure.
about some of the figures that popularize these drinks and the settings in which they do so?
Sure, absolutely. So really the father of tiki bar phenomenon is a guy who calls himself Don the Beachcomber. You'll be shocked to know that's not his birth name, although he did eventually legally change his name to Don Beach.
Catherine, just so you know, eventually that's where I'm sort of heading with my own names someday.
Well, I don't know how closely you want to follow this individual. He was a Texan by birth, but he left home at a pretty young age, 19 years old, because at that point in time, America was in the throes of prohibition. And he was a businessman who saw an opportunity, and he actually went off to become a rum runner. Or as he described it, he was doing research.
Okay, of course.
Researching rum in other countries, and how rum might be transported and used in products that people could drink. That was the focus of his research as a young man of university age. Instead of going to university, he went on some travels around the world and became rather wealthy. He would boast later about being involved in smuggling operations. He boasted after prohibition was ended.
Of course.
So much during. That tends to be a wiser choice, I think, for a tell-all disclosure. So after prohibition ended, Mr. Beach came back and settled in California, in Los Angeles. And by this point, he had compiled quite a lot of knowledge, not only about rum, but his travels had given him this taste of another world with which he knew most Americans were just not that familiar. And he had brought back with him souvenirs, which he claimed were representative of all of these islands in the South Pacific. He set up our very first tiki bar in America in 1937, named it after himself, Don Beachcombers. And it was immediately a hit with Hollywood elites of the day, but still somewhat inaccessible to most Americans. This would have been, a place with a very long line to get into. But quite a sensory experience where he had, I was describing the fake thunderstorms that would be experienced. He actually employed people to spray the windows with hoses to simulate thunderstorms happening for his guests and give them this really exotic experience.
Okay. Well, maybe I should not follow his his model then, as you said. So, yeah.
Yeah. So he was very creative, though. He eventually wound up moving to Hawaii, where he set up more of these operations. He did serve during World War II. And his wife at that point was left in charge of the business. She went on and expanded the operation to 16 additional tiki bars around the country during World War II. So their empire just kept growing and growing. His Hawaiian headquarters, he built his office in a tree house overlooking his dominion of shops and beachside bars, and it was quite an exotic place.
Sounds appealing, though. I mean, sounds appealing.
It's a life.
And I think, more broadly, what you've stressed here is that it is very much the ambiance and the augmented sensory experience which makes a place memorable. I mean, we return to restaurants or to bars or to even museums because of what we feel. And that, I think, is actually absolutely central to why we connect to a certain place. And so that then begs the question: if this is a relatively foreign experience, something that's relatively unfamiliar to most American audiences, why does it begin to resonate with so many people? What's going on globally that's starting to popularize this specific aesthetic? And so maybe you want to start to locate us in
Sure.
the World War II era. Yeah.
Well, World War II certainly opens the gates for Americans on a large scale to this world of the islands in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. We really start to focus our minds there. It's been so out of most Americans' reach for much of their history. But suddenly this is a focus that we're seeing in the news. This is a theater of war. And what's interesting is that we have both our servicemen in World War II are engaged in truly horrifying battle experiences on so many of these islands. But then the islands also become a place of respite, of peace. When they're on breaks, they're able to go and relax in these beautiful locations. So even though this is a site of extensive trauma that is being collected, it also becomes a place of romance, of hiding something of themselves where they can not be involved in war for a little bit. So when those servicemen come home from World War II, they're taking home these memories with them, and they're taking souvenirs back. So they've been exposed to this world. They made friendships, relationships, and they're bringing that back. And so that's really where we start to see a wider interest in everything tropical, but especially the tiki bars as a place for recreation among more Americans.
If I may personalize this for a minute, I had two grandfathers and a great uncle that all of whom served in the Pacific Theater, and two of them saw relatively heavy combat. And what's so remarkable is I never quite knew my great uncle. I was given sort of a bag of medals, but also I was given this journal of photographs that he had taken. And what was sort of striking to me is, again, this is someone who had been engaged in relatively heavy combat, but as you said, there are just literally dozens of these images that he took, of the islands, of beach scenes, of tropical oases, of people that he encountered. And that seemed to be the thing that he must have guarded very closely to his heart, and was one of the more memorable aspects of this experience, despite the kind of horrific experiences that he saw in war. He also had this respite, as you noted, from those combat experiences, and it was something that was obviously deeply valuable to him. I mean, there's very few things that he brought back home stateside, but that journal of the album of photographs is something that, you know, I've had in my family, obviously 50 plus years. And so that's an interesting concept
It's
that,
really fascinating.
yeah, I hadn't really thought about it until you just said that now. I know we had prepared beforehand, but I hadn't thought about it. And again, it's sort of this distant memory, but, you know, I have it not too far from where I'm sitting right now. And like I said, I never could talk to him personally. He was too old and I was too young. But that must have resonated with him in some sort of really powerful way. And he was from West Virginia. He's from a rural place. His family was primarily miners. And so that's interesting. That must have been an experience that was transcendent. I mean, it must have struck home to probably literally tens of thousands of Americans who had experienced war in the Pacific Theater. And as Catherine said, this is the site of some of the most horrific combats, some of the most brutal killings, and just incomprehensible scenes. But at the same time, you know, warfare in this area is dichotomous. And so they also must have sought to reconnect to that arena, but more broadly, as you said, it started to resonate among Americans, and it started to sort of percolate in American culture in the post World War II era. Is that correct?
Right. So one of the examples that I think really typifies this it's a form of romanticism by veterans of World War II, looking back to these experiences with a fondness we might not expect them to have, is the author James Michener, who writes, he is actually one of these servicemen. He is in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He's actually assigned to write a history of the Navy, but so he has this wide permission to travel to multiple different islands, and really has kind of a journalist experience of the war. But he comes back and writes his novel entitled Tales of the South Pacific, which is really a series of short stories that could stand on their own. There is a theme that weaves them together. But each story is essentially about a group of American soldiers who are trying to liberate some island from Japanese occupation. And they have all sorts of different adventures on different themes. But it also becomes, it's a wildly popular book that wins the Pulitzer Prize, and then inspires a musical, which we know as South Pacific, which just focuses on one or two of his stories in that collection. That musical on Broadway then gets even bigger as a film. And all of this is happening, I think the novel is published in 47 or 48, and then the musical and the film are stretching well into the 50s. So all of this is kind of encouraging on a wide scale this continued positive association of the American war effort in these regions. They're acknowledging that there is a lot of pain, but they're also, there is the sense that we're looking at this through a lens of victory, that this is a conflict that America won. The islands are seen as liberated. So there's a sense of pride in all of this as well. And I think that helps contribute to this interest in fostering these memories and keeping this interest in the culture alive.
I agree entirely. And I think to sort of move us into the slightly post-World War II era, And to get us back to the important subject of the drink itself, I mean, Americans are living in a scary era. You know, after 1945, it's the atomic age.
Mhm.
There's the proliferation of bomb shelters. Families are beginning to stockpile items, and there's this uncertainty with which people are living, under which people are living, uh, not knowing what's going to happen next. And so, how can we connect tiki bars, alcohol, to sort of the atomic age? What exactly are Americans seeking to perhaps escape in the midst of all of this? And how then do they find that escape through their vodka and rum infused blue Hawaiian or blue Hurricane?
Well, if you've summarized, you've hinted at this a little bit. Coming home from World War II, the world is changing very rapidly. And even though there is a sense of a victory that has occurred, there's also a sense for many Americans in this generation of an innocence lost that many desperately want to reclaim. There's a longing that is expressed for this simpler lifestyle. We're watching so many technological advances hitting at once, and it might seem a little overwhelming for some people. We are witnessing some of the major battles in the civil rights movement are playing out, and people are watching many traditions that they in terms of social structure are being challenged, and there's a lot that seems to have changed in a very short period of time. I think that's frightening for a lot of people. We also have the looming presence of what wasn't a victory, in terms that our ally in World War II, the Soviet Union, is now our silent enemy, and we are fully engaged in the Cold War. One writer has described the Tiki bar as being the emotional bomb shelter of the atomic age. This was something, as you know, I set this up as the beginning as this completely separate experience, so far removed from anything else that the average Americans were experiencing in their daily lives. It is complete escapism from the rush to work. We're seeing the boom of commuter communities are starting to pop up. All of these pressures of the 50s with the Cold War, with technologies exploding all over. There's so much happening, so many challenges to the world that was before World War II. And some of those are challenges that we need to deal with. But it is this weird, wacky, escapist bar culture becomes, as that writer called it, the emotional bomb shelter, where people are basically casting off everything else that their society expects them to be.
I think that's a good phrase, right? And I think sometimes too, you know, each generation as they're living an experience feels as though it's unparalleled. The changes with which they are grappling with are unprecedented. Yet, as you go back in time, you sort of see each generation itself dealing with those same challenges. And certainly this post-World War II era, this post-World War II is experiencing unprecedented changes. A technology is created that literally has the ability to destroy the entire world. I mean, that's something that is existential and of a just extremely profound nature. And as Catherine said, you know, the alliance among Great Britain, the United States, and Russia sort of secured victory in World War II, yet by 1945, 1946 had entirely soured, and creates the circumstances that lead to almost a 50-plus year Cold War that while cold, ultimately does cost a lot of human lives and an immense amount of resources as is being waged among these two superpowers. So all of this in turn, so if we move past the existential dilemmas with which the generation of the 1940s and 50s are dealing with, what happens to this drink? So this isn't something that I'm entirely familiar with. In bar culture, it's something that has clearly been modified over time. So that would suggest that at some point in the 20th century, it was no longer as popular. Perhaps there were historical circumstances that prompted a shift in people's interests. So maybe you can locate why the lifespan of this drink is a bit circumscribed. What exactly happened in the post-World War II era?
Well, as time marches on, we have a number of factors that start to hint toward the demise of this drink, of its sister drinks, and the tiki bar phenomenon as a whole. One of the major issues that some writers have tied to the downfall of tiki culture is the Vietnam conflict. So we are now dealing with a generation after World War II. This generation will also go to these faraway tropical settings, will also face horrific battles, horrific battle experiences. But this generation will not have the same sort of romantic idea, at least not on such a large scale, that the World War II veterans will experience. And I think a lot of that has to do with public support or lack thereof. The idea of a definite victory that World War II veterans came home to versus protests and anger and a lot of feelings of lack of support that Vietnam veterans had to cope with when they came home.
Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
I apologize. I think it's important to stress here, though, that this is a phenomenon that changes over time, which makes it all the more dramatic. And so the World War II generation in the 1950s and in the 1960s had the hometown parades, had been enjoyed widespread celebration, which was certainly well deserved given the existential threat that they faced in the 1940s with Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and so on. And so the young, primarily men of the Vietnam generation were seeing this and experiencing this in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And so when they enlisted voluntarily or eventually were drafted into service, there was this optimism that they themselves felt that they were part of something larger as well. And in the early phases of the Vietnam War, 1965, 1966, 1967, they felt a kindred, a profound connection to their parents' generation. Yet by 1968, 1969, and certainly into the early 1970s, that transforms radically. And we don't need to get into the nuances of the Vietnam War here. We're trying to have a cocktail hour. But suffice it to say, many veterans felt as though the administration wasn't necessarily being above board, that the war itself had lost some sense of direction. And I think what's so profound about that shift is how the veterans themselves sort of articulated, where they went in thinking that they were doing something comparable to what their parents had done in Europe or the Pacific during World War II, and instead felt as though they were in a war that increasingly didn't make as much sense. And so to connect this back to the drink, I mean, the shift is so dramatic within the span of only a couple of years. And I think that's really important to stress. Whereas this culture that had once embraced and romanticized a certain element of the Pacific, it turns 180 degrees in a very, very short window. Because,
exactly.
Yeah. So, and please now continue. I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to really stress that point of how quickly that shift occurs and how dramatic that shift is in the grand scheme of things.
Yes. We also, even if we look back at Mishner's novel or collection of short stories, his writing journey on that book begins with a real life experience meeting a woman who is working on a plantation on an island that is governed by French colonial forces. And she is a native Vietnamese woman who doesn't want to be on this island working on a plantation. She wants to go home to Vietnam, and she's blaming the French colonial government for not allowing her to do this. So this is something that he is, and this is a conflict that of course will eventually spiral into what we come to know as the Vietnam War, but he's already seen this in World War II. So that there's a pressure that is there. It's something that is present, and it's just sort of subtly, that's not a story that's told. And this is not the fun part of this experience that is taken back and put into a bar and creates a fun time for so many Americans. So there, yes, this bar culture kind of falls apart as Vietnam hits, but there's another way of looking at it, as perhaps we're finally coming to grips with the reality that had been ignored all of this time. So that's one criticism that has been lodged against the entire Tiki phenomenon, that it was these people celebrating all of these motifs just thought it was fun and games and failed to realize that these were real places, real countries, real cultures that had their own conflicts. It's not just fun and games.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's an interesting question here, because we did jump from World War II to Vietnam, and we didn't Korea. And so the question is, how does or could the Korean War, being a direct interface with communism, cause some sort of fracture or dissolution of this Tiki culture? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. There isn't a whole lot of literature that I've found on the Korean War, although it does have a number of criticisms as well. What we see, however, in the rise of the Tiki culture, it's starting late 1940s and is really hitting its height, I'd say, just as Korea is ending. So that's not something that has really been explored that much.
It's in some ways, it's America's forgotten war, right?
Yeah.
Another, I hate to use the word ambiguous conflict, because of course human lives are being lost here, but there's a certain degree of ambiguity with Korea, as there is with Vietnam, and there's a certain uncertain legacy also that sort of lingers in American culture. So I guess it's not entirely surprising that there hasn't been a great deal written about or commented upon.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And yes, there is actually a segment of academic research literature devoted to Tiki bars.
Of course there is. Of course there is. I imagine it's in the realm of cultural anthropology, maybe.
Yes, okay. I suppose so.
Yeah. But I make light of it. I shouldn't. Because I think this is, I'm a cultural historian, and I mean, this is the stuff that fascinates us, right? And I think what's been so interesting about this evening is that we take something rather banal and even fun, and we don't make it unfun, but there is this really deeper history to it, and I think we sort of readily consume things without really thinking. And in this instance, we have a drink that pretends to be an element of an authentic culture, but it actually is not. It's fabricated largely to cater to a certain audience in the early 20th century. And then because of a whole host of international phenomenon, geopolitical events, it starts to gain popularity among American audiences. And then for at least a several decade period, it enjoys a great deal of popularity. And then the Tiki bar itself, in turn, proliferates across, I guess, I mean, it seems very West Coast, but certainly they exist in pockets of the East Coast, I imagine.
Yes, and it's made resurgences over the years. There was actually one opened up in Times Square a couple years ago, which I understand is another one of these just highly strange sensory experiences. I think they might have some better technology for fake thunderstorms than just spraying the windows with hoses.
I think your drums, though, were pretty good.
Yeah, thank you.
I believe for a minute there. I was really.
There's one, I think there's one in Washington, D.C. as well.
Okay.
So yeah, they tend to pop up every now and then, and again, they're always presented as this is unlike any other experience you're going to have, and there's some conflict with that too. They're not always free of criticism for creating these themed event venues.
And we have one viewer, Dan, who's just chimed in and said there's a new one in Kansas City. Oh
my.
Oh, and Patrick, one of our students here at Shepherd, we're very proud of Patrick, says that there is actually a prominent tiki bar in Baltimore, Maryland.
Yeah.
Who knew? So Catherine, if our viewers need a drink after at least hearing me talk, not you, but me, can you once again run through the ingredients for them?
Sure. And I'll post this in the comment section too, so you can have it. So you would need, it's for this version, you need
an authentic, quote unquote, authentic
yes,
version.
Authentic. Yes. It's vodka, you need 3/4 of an ounce, 3/4 of an ounce of white rum, Jamaican rum, preferably, or excuse me, Puerto Rican rum, 1/2 an ounce of blue Curaçao, which I can never say, 1 ounce of pineapple juice, 1/2 an ounce of lemon or lime juice, whichever you prefer, and 1/2 an ounce of simple syrup. You need a glass that you're going to fill with ice. Add everything in, just pour it on in, stir it up, and you can garnish that with a pineapple slice if you wish. And if you want to be truly authentic, go find yourself an orchid.
Orchid, yeah. Many of our viewers, I assume, have those readily at hand. And Catherine has demonstrated, of course, the umbrella, which is
yes,
likewise readily.
So the orchid was another kind of made up on the spot invention. They used to garnish all the drinks with these sugarcane sticks. Okay. But what people would do, they would nibble on the sticks and then leave them all over the ashtrays in that era. Of course, ashtrays everywhere. And Harry Yee, our inventor of this drink, got sick and tired of cleaning up sugar sticks out of ashtrays. So he put a flower in it because people weren't going to chew on the flower, he figured.
Hopefully not. As we learn, they're not good for you. So
no, don't eat flowers. Some of them are good, but unless you've studied edible wild plants, it's not a good idea to go experimenting.
Right. Big disclaimer for this evening. Don't
yes.
flowers. So with that, any departing words, Catherine?
I would just say again, if you enjoy this sort of blend of mixology and history, this is part of a regular series of programs that I do as fundraisers for various nonprofit organizations. Tonight's version is actually a preview of a program I'm going to be doing for the Harpers Ferry Park Association for their 50th birthday in February of 2021. Hopefully we will be able to have a party in February of 2021. So this is something that we do where we teach you how to make these drinks and tell you stories. Every drink, no matter how silly it might seem, has some sort of story behind it. Some of them are crazier than others. So thank you for letting me tell you this one.
Yeah, no, thank you. I learned an immense amount of information, which I appreciate. I'm a lifelong learner. To you all out there, thank you very much for your time on this Friday evening. I hope you are enjoying whatever drink you choose to be consuming this evening. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay well. And with that, we will sign off for this evening. So thank you all very much for your time. And again, be well. So
Yes.
bye.
Bye.